Hi, this is
Okay.
Gary Auden. We have an educast for you today, VoIP Security Delivered. With me today is the COO, the Chief Operating Officer of Virsae. And this is our second educast in our series. And this time we're going to be dealing with security rather than voice quality management. As we always do, we talk about what we're going to talk about. We need to bring you up to date on the VoIP security landscape, talk about common threats, why there are risks in security. We're going to focus a bit on the session border controller and its management, how automation can make a big difference here, and the really important question is there an ROI for this kind of solution? So let's start off with the first slide. What do you mean by that statement on the slide, Ross?
Well, that's the old management adage, Gary, that you can't manage what you can't measure. And in our case, you can't manage what you can't see. So as customers around the world are moving towards using SIP, using VoIP, and of course making those applications accessible and easy to use, they're often inadvertently opening up security issues on their network and amongst their applications. And that's simply because to make these applications easy to use and accessible, you naturally, you take a security risk in doing that. The move towards SIP is pretty compelling. There's additional functionality and cost savings to be had by enterprises. So you can understand why people are doing it. But the issue that we're seeing is that security vulnerabilities are being opened up through that very process. And these are in the hands of UC people who are often not up to speed with security. They're not used to dealing with security. It's something completely new to them.
Well, let's move on. Security landscape is rather broad, and one of the points you make here is a huge amount of money in toll fraud, but there's other security issues as well.
Oh, absolutely, Gary. So over the last few years, the issue of toll fraud seems to have been minimized in a lot of people's minds. They think that seeing the cost of calling has dropped so much that that problem has kind of gone away. But in fact, it's still a very big industry, and in fact, it's growing. It's larger than credit card fraud on a global basis. The average attack is $35,000. And the deployment of SIP, as I said before, deployment of SIP is offering hackers whole new ways to exploit toll fraud through theft of service and other types of attacks as well.
Well, let's move on. Would you talk about these 5 threats for a few minutes?
Sure. So theft of service or traditional toll fraud, obviously money driven. I saw a great educast recently featuring Jim Dalton from TransNexus, and he touched on some real world examples of toll fraud, and it is alive and well and happening out there. But there's also other attacks that are kind of also money driven, but can be sort of along the lines of ransomware. So where your service is attacked and the hackers are seeking some sort of monetary payment to cease and desist. They can attack through a general denial of service attack, which is just throwing a lot of genuine traffic at your session border controller, for example, and through that traffic stop your SBC from being able to handle genuine inbound or outbound traffic. There's also other specific types of attacks where your UC ports, the ports that deliver the content or the audio or video, can become attacked. That's known as RTP, injection attack. So, and while your session border controller can still handle calls, the audio or video side of it is knocked out, and it can't process calls that way. SIP can also be used as a means to penetrate your network. So malicious code can be delivered. That's known as SIP injection. So malicious code can be delivered into your network, and your servers can be taken control of by external parties. And of course, once they do that, it's not just your UC network that's at threat, but also your intellectual property, your customers' information perhaps is at risk and perhaps could be stolen.
Now, those are the threats. Let's talk about the risks to the customer here.
Well, the hackers are targeting poorly secured VoIP services. We've seen that we have supporting evidence internationally. 2/3 of attacks are targeting VoIP systems now because simply, as I mentioned before, simply they are a new vulnerability that's entered into the landscape, and they are often unmanaged. So these hackers can fly below the radar. There's financial losses that can result from this, whether your contact center being down, for example. What sort of cost is that? The dollar value is pretty hard to attach to that. But you also get brand damage, through your reputation as having been hacked. If that starts to circulate, that can be really damaging to your brand. And of course, the cost to fix these things, you have to engage a expert to investigate what's happened. And perhaps if you're the victim of a ransom type attack, that could be an ongoing thing that could last for quite some time. These vulnerabilities are genuine. As an example, here at Virsae, we placed a SIP registrar outside of our firewall, so we exposed that to the internet, and that device was found by hackers within hours. So we started to see registration attempts, call attempts against that. So these people are out there and they're working day and night to try and find vulnerabilities.
Now, most people think that the session border controller will protect them, but what you're saying here is it's really not enough.
Oh, absolutely, Gary. So the session border controller is a good start, and it's something you should absolutely have deployed in your network to protect you from the outside world. It's a bit like a firewall. Only much more targeted and much quicker at what it does. That, along with the lines of general good practice, where you've got to have your RTP and your signaling encrypted. Those are good things to do, and really are the baseline. But the problem is when they're not managed, when you don't know what's going on out there. So the analogy that we like to draw with this is the session border controller is like your home security. Right, so it's like having good latches on your doors, like having deadlocks, like having good catches and hardware on your windows to prevent bad guys getting in. But then over the top of that, you've got to have your security system, which is where the management side comes in. So at home, you're not just going to rely on your hardware to keep the bad guys out, your windows, your latches, your catches on your doors. You're not going to sit there and have that and not a security system as well. So what we're saying from a management perspective, you should have that security system overlaying on the top. And ideally, a good security system, perhaps one with video, is going to tell you when the bad guys are out there. So when they're trying the doors, the windows, the locks, heaven forbid they actually get in and set the alarm off. So you really want a good management system overlaying on the top so you can see what's going on.
You have a statement at the very end of this slide, unmanaged session border controllers. Is that common?
What we're seeing, Gary, is the vast majority of session border controllers being deployed are unmanaged. So people are taking that attitude that the SBC is enough. But in fact, it's really just the start, and it's kind of table stakes. That's where you should start. But over the top of that, you've got to have your management, and you've got to have real-time threat awareness.
You use the word visibility on the next slide, and that seems to be an obvious term, but is visibility really the key here?
Oh, absolutely, because you've got to keep these things up to date. So session border controller, you've got to constantly look at what the bad guys are doing and make adjustments accordingly. So within your session border controller, you have a series of rules that filter out the good guys from the bad guys, if you like. If those rules are being tested, you want to know about that. There can be cases when there's missing rules. So when someone's trying to get register an endpoint with your session border controller or sending invites, there might be a missing rule, and the fact that the call is failing is kind of by luck rather than by good management. So knowing what these bad guys are doing out there means you can adjust your configuration, you can adjust your software accordingly to stay one step ahead. Often, a good example is often when you're receiving invites or registration attempts from an untrusted or an unknown source, the best response to that is no response. As soon as you start saying, sending error messages back to that originating source, for example, they know there's a SIP registrar there. They know there's something they can have a crack at. You know, and often the best response to those types of attempts is to just completely ignore them and not respond. So understanding what's going on, how the bad guys are trying to get in is really, really important. And often these attempts are very, very subtle. You know, they can be, you know, 1 or 2 attempts every 2 or 3 seconds. So they don't necessarily stand out.
You use the word automation in the next screen. It makes me ask 2 questions. Are people too slow, and does this mean that people are a weakness in this operation?
Well, your people are slow and they can't possibly keep up with software and servers. And a good example of that is that every manufacturer will recommend that the administrators and the IT departments go through the logs and look at what's going on, you know, from that security point of view. And that, of course, requires people with skills. It also requires people to have the bandwidth to do that, to troll through logs. And, you know, everyone has their day jobs. And I don't know anyone who really in the real world can take the time to sit there and go through logs, you know, on a regular basis. It's usually done in response to some sort of incident, which by then in the security world is too late. You know, so software can just simply operate at a far greater speed. You know, it's not like a person, doesn't go on holiday, doesn't get sick, you know, and works 24 hours a day. So automation is really the key. Automation will also give you an unbiased opinion. So all of us being humans, you know, we've got our own predispositions and our own failings when it comes to looking at this sort of thing. And, you know, a good example of that I like to use is here at Virsae, we never get our software engineers to test their own code, simply because we've found that if engineers test their own code, they're missing stuff. They've got their own predispositions. They're assuming, they have assumed knowledge. They know how things work, so they don't tend to be as thorough as someone independent testing it.
Let's move on to the financial question. Everyone asks, how can I afford this? Is there really an ROI?
Well, the average attack, cost of an average attack is $35,000, which I think is actually relatively low. Because if you look at the SIP world, particularly from a toll fraud point of view, in the old days, there was limitations that were applied simply by you know, the reach the hackers could have around the world, the number of trunks, the number of calls that they could stand up, you know, and the speed at which they could do that. So now in the modern world with SIP, we have one application can launch thousands of calls per second. So the scale of the problem is potentially much, much bigger and has the potential to grow well above that $35,000. So the only thing that's going to limit how much you're exposed to from that point of view is the amount of time before you discover the vulnerability and close it. As I say, you can have thousands and thousands of calls per second made through your environment. There's intangibles attached to this as well. So you know, how do you put a price on your contact center being down, your reputational damage that you suffer as a result of that, the dent in your brand? You know, your company's probably spent hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, maybe more, building up that brand, building that reputation that's so important. You know, what's the value of putting a big dent in the side of that brand? It's pretty hard to say.
The next word is global view. And I, as a customer, would just see my world. What does a global view actually offer to us?
Well, what we're saying here is that you know, SIP and as services become internet-based, the international borders have been removed. So these hackers can sit anywhere around the world, in any country. They no longer have any costs associated with their business. They can sit there as long as they've got an internet account, an internet connection. They can launch thousands of attempts. They can hack multiple sites at one time. So there's no cost to these guys of doing this anymore. They can just sit back and hack away. And the management view needs to take into account all of this. So right across your network, like a lot of deployments now have gone global, and there will be session border controllers and VoIP servers deployed all over the world. You need to watch all of those at the same time. And not just your session border controller, as I mentioned, but your call managers, session managers, any CTI interfaces. They all give people an opportunity to get into your system and start doing some bad stuff.
Now you have a solution called Virsae Security Manager. Would you go through that for us, please?
Yeah, right. So we've just launched Security Manager. It's a recent addition to our ITIL set of services, and it's based on demand from our customers. So people are asking us to produce this visibility and to help them out from a security point of view. We've initially aimed that at the session border controllers because we see that as as the biggest threat that people have, the biggest vulnerability that's in their network. But over the next little while, we'll be extending that into the call servers, the CTI links, and so forth, and attempting to close all of those gaps. The big thing that we do is we bring real-time threat awareness into the picture. So as soon as some sort of malicious behavior is detected, and as I said before, this can be, they can be very, very subtle, these attacks. As soon as we pick up on that, we can let the right people know, and we can take action to close that vulnerability.
Virsae has been in the VoIP business for quite a while. You've demonstrated a lot of leadership. Can you go through those, please?
Right. So we have been around a few years now. We deliberately started out in this area to be a disruptor to the traditional players. And one of the ways we did that is we went with a cloud-based service from day one. So VSM, Virsae Service Management, is a true cloud service, which means there is one application serving the entire world. So we have millions of endpoints under management. We look at the call quality on over 300 million calls per month at the moment and growing very rapidly. Being cloud-based, the application is evergreen. So this is something that people have a little bit of trouble getting their head around, but in the cloud, the application is always the latest release. So for us, there's one application to maintain and update, and we do that on a 2-week cycle. So every 2 weeks, there's changes made to the application, there's bug fixes goes out, there's new features introduced. And because we're dealing with one application, we have a huge amount of data coming in from all of our customers. And we use big data analytics, we use machine learning across that to improve the service for everyone. As I said before, a lot of our updates are customer driven, so we can react very, very quickly. And this applies really, really well to the world of security. So when we see something that's going on at one customer, it's bound to affect another. And we can roll out fixes to everyone at the same time. So the concept of an enterprise application that you purchase and you kind of sweat that asset for 3 years and then you look at an update to get access to the new features, that's entirely gone. With a cloud-based application, true cloud application, your application is evergreen, it is always up to date.
So in a sense, you're saying your global knowledge provides global support for everybody who is part of your service.
That's right. So the changes that we introduce, the experiences that we get with one customer are effectively shared with the others. So there's a real community of VSM users, and particularly from a world of security, it makes everyone safer. Those learning and that information that we get from one site, we can share it everywhere.
I'd like to point out to people there are blogs, white papers, brochures, videos. There's a previous educast that Virsae produced on voice quality management, and so here's their site. Here's some contact information. For information, you can connect to Ross directly, so you get to actually talk to the person who's been part of this educast. I'd like to thank you, Ross, for recording today, and I hope everyone listening has learned something. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.